It was the stillness of the night that first caught my attention. It felt unnatural, like the world itself had paused, holding its breath. I was lying in bed, my mind lost in a swirl of chaotic images and sounds, when it came, the melody. Soft, delicate, but persistent, winding its way through the fog of my dreams. It was haunting, beautiful in a way that made my heart ache like a song from another world. The notes shimmered in my mind, each one tightening an invisible knot around my chest. I couldn't escape it. And then my eyes snapped open. The room was dark, only the faintest glow of moonlight seeping through the curtains. My breath quickened, shallow and erratic. My heart raced. I sat up, still hearing the melody, still feeling it. It wasn't just a dream. I swung my legs off the bed, the cold of the wooden floor seeping through my feet. I reached out, my fingers trembling, towards the small upright piano tucked in the corner of the room. The one my late mother had given me, my faithful companion in moments of doubt. But tonight, it felt more like an anchor in the midst of an unsettling sea. My hands moved to the keys instinctively, playing the same haunting tune that had woven its way through my dream. The sound filled the room, delicate and beautiful, but also heavy, charged with something I couldn't place. I didn't understand. Where had I heard this before? It felt ancient, as though it had been passed down through generations. But before I could make sense of it, a soft, chilling sensation brushed against the back of my neck. A cold breath that made me freeze. Evie. I couldn't move. My hands hovered above the keys. The voice was low, indistinct, but it was unmistakably real. My skin crawled, the room closing in around me as the shadows deepened. I turned, expecting to see someone there, but no one stood in the doorway. The room was empty. The voice had been so real. When morning came, sunlight did little to ease the unease that still clung to me. The melody played on in my mind, looping endlessly, refusing to be silenced. I tried to distract myself, focus on my work, but it was impossible. It was always there, lingering just beneath the surface. By the time Jonah arrived, I was on edge. He walked in, as calm and collected as ever, his satchel slung over one shoulder. He didn't even have to ask. He could see it on my face. "You look terrible," he said, his tone blunt as always. "Good morning to you too," I replied, though my voice was sharper than I intended. I couldn't help it. My nerves were frayed. "Jonah, something's happening. I can't get this melody out of my head. It's like it's calling me." He gave me a half smile, the kind he always reserved for humoring my eccentricities. "It's probably just stress. You've been working too hard." "No," I said, shaking my head fiercely. "It's more than that. Listen." I walked to the piano, sitting down with a sense of urgency. My fingers moved across the keys, playing the melody once more. The sound filled the room, eerie in its beauty. Jonah's smile faded as he listened, his eyes narrowing. "Where did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "In a dream," I confessed. "It's been haunting me for days." Jonah didn't speak right away. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a worn leather journal. As he flipped through its pages, my stomach twisted with unease. "That melody." He looked up at me, his expression serious. "It's tied to the old cathedral at the edge of town. There are stories about it. Legends, really. People say they hear singing coming from inside, but anyone who goes looking for the source doesn't come back." I stared at him, my breath catching. "You're joking." "I'm not," he said, his voice quieter now. "The melody matches a description in this journal. It's connected to the disappearance of a choir over a century ago." "A choir?" My voice faltered, dread creeping up my spine. What happened to them? They were supposed to perform at a festival, but they vanished. No one knows why. The town's avoided the cathedral ever since. A chill swept through the room. I could feel the weight of it settling in my chest, a knot tightening with each word Jonah spoke. This couldn't be a coincidence. The melody wasn't just a haunting tune, it was pulling me toward something. I have to go there, I said, my voice unwavering despite the fear building inside me. Jonah's face darkened, his skepticism now replaced by concern. Evie, don't be ridiculous. This is just a story, a superstition. No, I met his gaze, my expression firm. It's something more. I can feel it. Jonah groaned, rubbing his temples in frustration. You always have to make things complicated, don't you? I'm serious, Jonah. If there's even a chance this melody is connected to that place, I have to find out why it's haunting me. He sighed, resigned. Fine, but I'm coming with you. If you're going to chase after ghost stories, someone has to keep you grounded. I nodded, relief washing over me. We would face whatever awaited us in the shadows of the cathedral, together. And deep within its crumbling walls, something stirred. Something awakened by the sound of my name. The sun had just dipped below the horizon as Jonah and I stood at the edge of the woods. Before us stretched a path overgrown with tangled branches, the air heavy with an unsettling stillness. The skeletal trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky, as if they were reaching for something just beyond our sight. And beyond the thick thicket of trees, there it was, the abandoned cathedral. Its silhouette rose against the twilight like the jagged teeth of some ancient beast, waiting to devour whatever dared approach. Jonah muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible above the crunch of dead leaves beneath our feet. This is a bad idea. I didn't respond. Instead, I kept my focus fixed on the cathedral ahead, my heart pounding as the melody in my head grew louder with every step. It was no longer just a haunting song. It pulsed with a life of its own, vibrating through my chest as if it were tethered to something lurking in the shadows of that forsaken place. As we broke through the tree line, the cathedral loomed before us. Time had ravaged its once pristine facade, leaving it crumbling and decayed. Vines snaked up its weathered stone walls, moss clinging to the edges like an infection. The massive wooden doors, warped and weathered, hung ajar, as if they were inviting us in. Through the shattered stained glass windows, fragmented beams of moonlight spilled onto the ground. The air here was colder, heavier, as if the building itself exhaled sorrow with every passing gust. Jonah swore under his breath, his voice tight with apprehension. You can't tell me this place isn't cursed. I stepped forward, ignoring the chill creeping up my spine. You don't have to come with me, I said softly, glancing back at him. But I need to know. Jonah sighed, frustration and unease etched on his face. I'm not letting you go in there alone. Together, we approached the cathedral's entrance. As I pushed open the massive doors, they groaned in protest, their sound echoing like a mournful wail through the cavernous interior. The cathedral swallowed us whole, its darkness thick and oppressive. Jonah's flashlight swept across the space, revealing warped pews covered in dust, cobwebs hanging from the rafters like shrouds, and a massive pipe organ at the far end of the nave, its twisted pipes melted and corroded by some unseen force. This place looks like it's been abandoned for centuries, Jonah muttered, his voice low, as though afraid to disturb the silence. I stepped deeper into the nave, the dust swirling around my feet. The air was thick with mildew and decay, but beneath that, I could smell something else, a faint trace of incense, long since burned away. I paused, my gaze drawn upward. The shattered stained glass windows, despite their ruin, seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight, as though they still held a spark of life. "This is where it happened," I whispered mostly to myself. What happened?" Jonah asked, his tone sharp. "Where a bunch of choir singers vanished? Where your ancestors supposedly betrayed them? We don't even know if any of that is true." I turned to him, my resolve unshaken. "It doesn't matter if you believe it. Something happened here, Jonah. I can feel it." Before he could respond, a soft sound interrupted us. A faint, childlike giggle that seemed to ripple through the air. Jonah froze, his flashlight jerking upward to scan the shadows. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding. It sounded like a child. The giggle came again, closer this time. I spun around, my eyes darting across the room. And then, at the edge of the nave, I saw her. A little girl with pale skin and wide, frightened eyes, her hands clutching the tattered hem of her dress. "Adele," I whispered, recognizing her instantly. The child took a tentative step forward, her bare feet silent against the stone floor. "Help me," she said, her voice trembling. "He's coming." I froze. "Who's coming?" Before she could answer, the temperature in the room dropped drastically. The giggle morphed into a low, resonant hum, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls of the cathedral itself. The melody surged inside my mind, filling every corner like a tidal wave. I clutched my head, trying to block it out, but it was relentless. "Evie," Jonah's voice snapped me back to reality. He grabbed my arm, his grip firm. "We need to leave, now." The child's eyes widened in terror. She pointed toward the altar, her voice a panicked whisper. "He's here." The organ pipes groaned, a discordant sound that reverberated through the cathedral, and then a chilling wind swept through the space, extinguishing Jonah's flashlight. We were plunged into near-total darkness. In the dim glow of the moonlight filtering through the shattered windows, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, gaunt, its body wrapped in tattered formal attire that clung to its skeletal frame. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly light, and it gripped a conductor's baton that seemed to shimmer with malevolent energy. The demon conductor. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice a horrible grinding sound, like stone scraping against stone. "You've heard my melody, haven't you?" I stood frozen, my heart pounding so loudly it felt as though it would burst. Jonah stepped in front of me, his voice shaking. "Who? What are you?" The demon smiled, a grotesque, mocking thing, and pointed its baton at me. "I am the maestro of this symphony," it said, its voice dripping with malice, "and she," it pointed at me, "is my newest soloist." Before we could react, the doors slammed shut behind us, their sound deafening. We were trapped inside the cathedral's shadow with no way out. The sound of the cathedral doors slamming shut echoed through the vast space, sending a shockwave of icy fear straight into my bones. The darkness that followed seemed to press in from every corner, broken only by the fractured moonlight spilling through the ruined, stained glass windows. The silence was suffocating, until one note rang out. A single, haunting sound that vibrated through my chest like a pulse. Jonah's grip tightened on my arm. "Evie, we need to get out of here." But I couldn't move. The melody. It was no longer just a song. It had wrapped itself around me, pulling me forward, urging me to step deeper into the shadows. My eyes were fixed on the figure that had emerged from the darkness. The demon conductor. He stood before us, a terrifying blend of decay and elegance. His skeletal frame was draped in tattered formal attire, The fabric blackened and burned as if it had been scorched by some unearthly fire. His face was hollow, skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, and his eyes glowed with an eerie, fiery light. In his bony hand, he held a conductor's baton, its tip shimmering with malevolent energy, trailing faint crimson light in the air as he moved. The demon conductor tilted his head, his gaze fixed on me. "Ah," he said, his voice deep, resonant, and layered with the echoes of countless voices. "The bloodline returns." I swallowed hard, my voice trembling as I forced the words out. Who are you?" A grin stretched unnaturally wide across his face, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. "I am the maestro of this symphony of despair, the keeper of the melody you cannot escape. You may call me the conductor." Jonah stepped in front of me, his flashlight flickering like it too feared the figure before us. "Stay away from her," he demanded, his voice shaky but firm. The conductor's eyes flicked to Jonah, amusement dancing in his fiery gaze. Ah, the protector, so brave, so foolish. He raised his baton, and at his command, the ghostly choir materialized behind him. They were spectral figures, their forms translucent and shimmering, their faces twisted with anguish. Their mouths were open in silent screams, and their presence felt like a heavy weight in the air, pressing down on my chest. The conductor waved a hand toward them. "You've heard their lament," he said. "These souls are bound to me, their voices eternal prisoners of my symphony, all because of your bloodline." I couldn't breathe. "My bloodline? What are you talking about?" The conductor's grin twisted into something darker, something far more malicious. "Your great-grandfather was the one who betrayed them. A simple man, given a simple choice, sacrificed the choir to save the town. He chose to condemn them to me, binding their voices to my melody for all eternity." Jonah shook his head, disbelief in his voice. "That's impossible. You're lying." The conductor laughed, a sound that echoed with the cries of the damned. "Oh, the historian doubts me. How quaint. Shall I show you the truth?" With a flick of his baton, the cathedral seemed to shimmer and shift around us. The walls, once decayed and crumbling, transformed into a vibrant, pristine space. The pews were filled with ghostly townsfolk, and the choir stood alive and whole, their faces radiant with hope as they sang a jubilant hymn. At the center of it all stood a man, my great-grandfather, his features unmistakably similar to my own. He stood at the altar, shaking hands with a shadowy figure cloaked in darkness. The scene shifted. The hymn twisted into a mournful dirge. The choir's joy turned to terror as the shadowy figure raised its hand. Chains of light lashed around their necks, and the ghostly audience disappeared in a gust of wind. Only the choir remained, their cries of betrayal echoing through the space. The cathedral returned to its decayed state, and the conductor spread his arms wide. A deal sealed in blood and song. A betrayal that echoes through generations. My mind reeled, my vision blurred. No, he wouldn't. He couldn't have. He did, the conductor hissed, his voice low and venomous. And now, you must decide. Will you make the same choice? Will you continue his legacy of betrayal, or will you take their place? Jonah grabbed my arm, his voice fierce. Don't listen to him, Evie, he's manipulating you. The conductor's grin widened, his fiery eyes never leaving me. Am I? Or am I merely presenting the truth? My heart raced as I looked at the ghostly choir. Their eyes met mine, silently pleading for help, their suffering visible in their twisted expressions. What do you want from me? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The conductor stepped closer, his skeletal frame towering over me. A choice. Take their place, and their voices will be freed. or make a new pact with me. Save yourself and your brother and let the melody continue to claim others. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me, suffocating me. I glanced at Jonah, who shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "Don't do it," he pleaded. "We'll find another way." The conductor's fiery gaze pierced into mine, his voice low, hypnotic. "Time is fleeting, Evie Harper. Decide." The melody swelled, filling my mind with anguish, its notes stabbing into my heart like knives. The faces of the ghostly choir blurred, their voices rising through the melody like sobs. The conductor raised his baton slowly, deliberately, and the choir began to sing once more. Their sorrowful song cut through me, and I closed my eyes, my hands trembling. The choice was mine, and no matter what I decided, it would cost me everything. The cathedral felt alive, its ancient walls groaning, exhaling a breath of decay as if waiting for my decision. The conductor stood unmoving at the altar, his fiery eyes locked onto me, and his bony fingers gripped the glowing baton with a chilling intensity. Behind him, the ghostly choir swayed, their mournful song filling the air with sorrow that seemed to tug at my very soul. Jonah stood close, his hand gripping my arm tightly, his voice a sharp whisper in my ear. "Evie, don't. You can't trust him." But I couldn't look away from the choir. Their faces, translucent and shimmering, twisted with agony, and I knew in my heart that they weren't just lost souls, they were trapped, bound to this endless cycle of torment, all because of a decision made by my great-grandfather. And now they looked to me for salvation. The conductor's voice sliced through the oppressive melody, smooth and sharp like a blade through silk. "Do not delay, Evie Harper. Their pain is yours to end or perpetuate." I could barely steady my voice as I asked, "What happens if I refuse?" The conductor's grin stretched unnaturally wide, revealing sharp teeth. "Then the melody continues. It will echo in your blood, your dreams, your every waking thought. It will drive you mad as it has so many before you." Jonah stepped forward, placing himself between me and the conductor. "That's not a bargain. That's extortion. You're using her." The conductor's fiery gaze flicked to Jonah, his grin never faltering. "And you, historian, are the parasite that feeds on the tragedy of others. Do not lecture me on morality." The choir's song swelled, filling the cathedral with a crescendo that reverberated through my chest. I could feel the melody thrumming inside me like a caged bird desperate to escape. The weight of my decision pressed down on me, and my knees buckled. Jonah caught me before I fell, his voice frantic. "Evie, listen to me. There has to be another way. We'll find it." I shook my head, my eyes brimming with tears. "I don't think there is, Jonah. It feels like it's been waiting for me." The conductor took a step forward, casting an impossibly long shadow across the altar. "There is no time for sentiment. Choose, Evie Harper. Will you take their place, or will you carry the curse forward? Perhaps a new pact could be made, something more beneficial." "What kind of pact?" I whispered, my voice trembling. His grin darkened, and he extended his hand toward me. "Join me. Become my muse, my eternal soloist. Your voice will ring through the ages, unbound by mortal limitations. The choir remains, but you will live." "No!" Jonah shouted, grabbing my shoulders, turning me to face him. "You can't do this. Don't let him manipulate you. You're stronger than this." I stared into Jonah's desperate eyes, my hands trembling. "It's not about strength, Jonah. It's about making this right." My gaze shifted to the choir, their spectral forms glowing faintly in the darkness. Each face seemed to plead with me, their silent cries pulling at my resolve. Among them stood Adele, her small figure reaching out to me with a ghostly hand clutching at her chest. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't let us sing forever." I turned back to the conductor. "If I take their place, what happens to me?" His expression remained unchanged, but I saw a flicker of something almost human, in his fiery eyes. "You become the foundation of the melody. Your voice will bind the harmony together endlessly, a sacrifice that ensures the choir's freedom." "And they'll be free, truly free?" I asked. The conductor's smile softened, though it was no less unsettling. "Their souls will ascend, untethered by the curse." Jonah shook his head violently, his voice rising with panic. "No, there has to be another way. Don't give him what he wants." I looked at my brother, my voice soft but resolute. "This isn't just about me, Jonah. It's about ending something that should have never happened." With trembling hands, I stepped toward the altar. My steps were steady, even as my heart raced and my hands shook. The conductor extended his baton toward me, its glowing tip brushing against my chest. The melody surged, filling my ears and drowning out Jonah's protests. "Do you accept?" the conductor asked, his voice a low rumble. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision crushing me. With tears streaming down my face, I whispered, "I accept." A burst of blinding light exploded from the baton, and the entire cathedral shook as the melody reached its deafening climax. The ghostly choir's chains dissolved in radiant bursts, their spectral forms glowing brighter and brighter until they vanished completely. Adele's figure lingered for a moment longer, her face radiant with gratitude, before she too disappeared in a cascade of light. Pain shot through my throat, and my vision blurred as I crumpled to the ground. My voice was gone, replaced by an unbearable silence. Jonah rushed to my side, shaking me gently. "Evie, say something." I opened my mouth, but no sound came. My voice, the very core of who I was, had been sacrificed to end the curse. Tears streamed down my face as I mouthed the words, "It's over." The conductor stood motionless, his skeletal form dimming, flickering as though the light of his power was waning. "A choice well made," he said softly, before dissolving into shadow, leaving only the faint echo of the melody behind. Jonah held me tightly as the cathedral grew silent. The curse was broken, but the cost was more than either of us had ever imagined. The cathedral trembled, the last remnants of the spectral choir fading into glowing embers. Their mournful song was replaced by an ominous, pulsating silence, the kind that felt like it was pressing against my chest. My body trembled as the weight of my decision settled around me, every breath heavy with the knowledge that the curse wasn't over, not yet. Jonah was beside me, his hands gripping my shoulders, trying to anchor me to the present, but his voice sounded distant, muffled by the deafening silence in my mind. Then the conductor laughed. It wasn't just a laugh, it filled every corner of the cathedral, deep and resonant, layered with countless voices. Some screamed, others wept, all mingling in a symphony of despair. Though he flickered like a dying flame, the demon conductor stood tall at the altar, his skeletal form radiating an unnatural energy. "You think this is over?" he hissed, his fiery eyes narrowing on me. "You think you've won?" I looked up at him, my voice gone, but my gaze unwavering. I couldn't speak, but I was defiant. The fire inside me hadn't gone out, not yet. Jonah stepped forward, positioning himself between me and the conductor, his face a mix of anger and fear. "She's done what you asked," Jonah snapped, his voice sharp. "The choir is free. Let her go." The conductor's grin widened, jagged and malicious. "Foolish boy, the choir may be free, but the melody remains. The curse is not so easily silenced. Its roots run deep, deeper than you could possibly comprehend. I could feel the air around us thickening, the hum of the melody growing louder, more fractured. The very stones of the cathedral seemed to resonate with its power. The conductor raised his baton, and the melody swelled, chaotic and agonizing, its dissonance tearing through the air like jagged glass. "You gave me your voice, Evie Harper," the conductor growled. "But a sacrifice is only the beginning. The melody demands more. It will devour you piece by piece until nothing remains." Jonah turned to me, panic flashing in his eyes. "We need to get out of here now." But I shook my head, my hands gripping his arm. I couldn't speak, but my eyes told him everything. This isn't finished. The conductor's form began to glow faintly, solidifying as the melody fed on the energy in the room. The shattered stained glass vibrated, the fragments catching the light like dying stars. "You see?" he taunted. "You cannot end the melody. It is eternal. I am eternal." I staggered to my feet, my legs shaking but my resolve firm. My mind raced, searching for a way to stop him. My eyes fell on the remnants of the pipe organ at the far end of the nave. Though decayed, it still held a strange, dark presence, its twisted pipes like the ribs of some long-dead beast. I grabbed Jonah's arm and pointed toward the organ. He hesitated, confused. "The organ? What about it?" I mimed the melody, tapping my chest, feeling its hum deep inside me. Jonah's eyes widened with realization. "You think the organ is the source? That it's tied to the melody?" I nodded, my heart pounding. The conductor's laugh echoed through the cathedral. "Ah, clever little songbird, but even if you destroy the organ, the melody will endure. It is woven into the very fabric of this place, and into you." I ignored him, pulling Jonah toward the organ. But as I reached out, spectral chains shot from the shadows, wrapping around my wrists and ankles. I cried out silently as the chains burned with cold fire, dragging me to my knees. "Evie!" Jonah shouted, rushing to me. But before he could reach me, the conductor flicked his baton, and a gust of wind threw Jonah back against the pews. He landed with a groan, clutching his side. The conductor loomed over me, his grin a mask of malice. "You cannot escape your fate. You are the melody now." I gritted my teeth, the chains digging into my skin as I struggled. My gaze darted to the organ, its pipes vibrating with the dissonant hum of the melody. With all my strength, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small locket that had belonged to my great-grandfather, the symbol of his betrayal. The conductor's fiery eyes flickered when he saw the locket. "What are you doing?" I gripped the locket tightly, my hands trembling. I mouthed a silent prayer, then hurled the locket toward the organ. The moment it struck the base of the pipes, a blinding light erupted, and the melody fractured into 1,000 discordant shards. The cathedral shook violently, cracks spidering up the walls as the organ began to collapse in on itself. The conductor screamed, his skeletal form flickering and breaking apart like ash caught in a gale. "No!" he roared, his voice a cacophony of rage and desperation. "You cannot silence me." I felt a searing pain in my chest as the chains dissolved, their icy grip replaced by a heat that spread through me. The melody, once an unbearable weight, now felt lighter, softer, like it was fading away. Jonah crawled to me, his hands gripping my shoulders. "Evie, stay with me." The conductor let out one final, ear-splitting wail as his form disintegrated, his baton falling to the ground and shattering into embers. The organ collapsed completely, its pipes crumbling into dust. The melody died with it, leaving only silence. I collapsed into Jonah's arms, my body weak but my heart at peace. The cathedral, now crumbling around us, seemed to exhale one final breath as its cursed power dissipated. Jonah held me tightly, his voice trembling. "You did it, Evie. You ended it." I mouthed the words, "It's over," though no sound escaped. My voice was gone, but the curse was broken, and the choir was free. As we stumbled out of the collapsing cathedral into the cool night air, the sky above us was clear, filled with stars. The weight of the melody was gone, leaving only a profound silence. A silence that, for the first time in weeks, felt like peace. The sky above us was a blanket of ink, the stars glittering like ancient diamonds in a forgotten sky. The weight of the cathedral's crumbling ruins loomed behind us, its shadow no longer oppressive but broken. The air was still, as though the world itself had exhaled a long-held breath. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was silence, complete and absolute. The melody that had plagued me for so long, the one that had invaded my every thought, my every dream, was gone. I leaned against Jonah, my legs unsteady beneath me. My voice, my very essence, had been taken, sacrificed to free the souls trapped within the choir. Yet, even in my silence, I felt a quiet victory. The curse had been broken, the choir was free, and the demon conductor, gone, reduced to nothing but the echo of a dark history. Jonah's arm was around me, holding me steady, but his grip was gentle, careful, as if afraid I might slip away. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from the chaos of the cathedral's collapse. His breath came in shallow, exhausted gasps, but there was something else in his gaze, something tender, something protective. "You did it, Evie," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the screams, the tension, the pain. "You saved them. You ended it." I managed a weak smile, though it felt like a distant echo. I wanted to speak, to tell him I was fine, that the weight of the choice hadn't broken me, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was raw, empty. The silence in my mouth was louder than anything I had ever known. Jonah seemed to understand. He didn't need me to speak. He looked at me, his brow furrowed with a mixture of concern and awe. "But at what cost, Evie? Your voice?" He trailed off, the question hanging between us like a heavy fog. I shook my head gently, my eyes bright with unspoken resolve. The sacrifice, as painful as it was, had been worth it. The choir was free, the town was free, and despite the emptiness I felt inside, I knew I had done the right thing. The ruins of the cathedral loomed behind us like a broken monument to tragedy. The once grand structure, now a skeleton of its former self, seemed almost peaceful in the quiet night. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a strange lightness, as though the very land itself had been unburdened. The curse, once so thick and oppressive, had been lifted, leaving behind only the remnants of forgotten sorrow. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of lavender and gold, I felt something else stir within me. It wasn't the return of my voice, no, that was gone forever. But there was peace, a deep, profound peace. The town would go on, life would move forward, and though I would never hear the music again, I would always carry the memory of the people I had saved. Jonah looked at me, his face weary but soft. "Evie, I don't know what to say," he admitted quietly, his eyes searching mine. I pressed my hand to my chest, as if to convey everything that words could not. I had no need to explain. I had saved the souls of the choir, yes, but in doing so, I had saved myself. The sacrifice of my voice had freed me from the constant weight of the past, of the melody that had haunted me for so long. It had freed me from the burden of what I could not change. The silence that followed was not deafening. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, when the clouds have parted and the first rays of light break through. fragile and tentative but full of promise. I leaned into my brother's embrace, letting the warmth of his presence ground me. He had been my protector throughout this ordeal, and now, as the world began to awaken from the nightmare, it felt like the weight of our shared burden was finally starting to lift. "Come on," Jonah said softly, pulling me from my reverie. "We should get home." Home. The word tasted strange in my mouth, yet it felt right. We walked away from the ruins together, the broken cathedral growing smaller behind us, swallowed by the forest and the creeping dawn. The path we followed was quiet, but it was no longer empty. There was a new kind of hope in the air, something that had been lost in the shadows of the past, but was now being born anew. As we walked, my gaze wandered upward. The sky, once dark and suffocating, was now open, a vast canvas of possibility. I knew I would never hear music again, not the way I once had. But perhaps it didn't matter. Perhaps the music I had been searching for, had been haunted by, wasn't meant to be heard with my ears, but felt within my heart. The dawn grew brighter, and with it, the promise of a new beginning. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief, a sense of closure. The haunting melody was gone, and so was the weight of the curse that had plagued my family for generations. The silence I carried now was my own, a silence of peace, of freedom, of release. And in that silence I was finally, truly free. Years had passed since the crumbling of the cathedral, and life in the small town had quietly resumed its rhythms. The once terrifying ruins of the cathedral now lay forgotten by most, overtaken by creeping ivy and the quiet passage of time. To the few who still remembered the legend of the cursed choir, the ruins were little more than a faded memory, an old, unsettling story passed down through the generations, its edges softened by years of neglect. Yet, even now the echoes of the past still lingered, hidden in the very fabric of the town, like a secret whispered in the wind. I stood at the window of my small home, watching the last traces of sunlight fade behind the horizon. The air was cool, but there was a warmth in my chest, a quiet peace I had come to know after the sacrifices, after the breaking of the curse. The town had healed, and so had I. The melody that once tore through my mind was gone, but something had replaced it, a deep, enduring silence filled with memories. Memories that no longer haunted me, but instead comforted me. In the years following the fall of the demon conductor, Jonah had written a book, a careful recounting of the history of the choir, of their tragedy and betrayal, and of their eventual freedom. The book wasn't filled with supernatural tales or wild embellishments. Instead, it was a quiet, respectful tribute to the lives that had been lost and the price that had been paid to release them. It became a local legend, the story of a sister who sacrificed her voice to save those long trapped in sorrow, the silent hero who had broken a curse that had lasted centuries. But for me, the true story was never captured in words. I no longer taught music, though I still frequented the small school I'd once worked at, watching the new generation of children grow up with laughter and song. I had found a new way to teach, a quieter way to impart the lessons that had once come so naturally through my voice. I taught them to listen, to feel, to find music in the world that lay just beyond the surface, in the rhythm of footsteps on a rain-drenched street, in the rustle of leaves as the wind passed through them. Sometimes, when I passed the old cathedral, I would stop, my gaze lingering on the broken spires and cracked stone. The place that had once been the heart of so much pain and suffering now stood silent, its curse lifted, its ghosts free. I wondered sometimes if the souls of the choir ever returned to visit, if they lingered in the soft breezes that whispered through the ruins, or if their voices had truly been set to rest. On one quiet evening, as the sun dipped low, I walked to the edge of the woods where the path to the cathedral once began. The ground was soft underfoot, and the trees stood tall, their leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. I stopped in front of a small stone marker, one that had been placed years ago, near the spot where the cathedral had once cast its shadow. The marker was simple, the inscription worn with age but still legible. In memory of the choir, their voices free, their melody silent. I traced the worn letters with my fingers, my thoughts drifting back to those final moments, to the terrible choice I had made and the peace that had followed. My sacrifice had been worth it. The town had healed, the ghosts had been freed, and I had found something I hadn't even realized I was searching for. Myself. The silence in my life, the one that had once felt like a void, now felt like a gentle embrace. It was a silence filled with peace. And as I stood there, surrounded by the echoes of the past, I realized that those echoes weren't just remnants of pain and sorrow. They were part of my story. They were the reminder of what I had done, the price I had paid, and the strength I had found in myself. The wind picked up, and for a moment I thought I heard something, a soft, distant melody. It wasn't the same as the haunting tune that had tormented me all those months ago, but it was there, faint and ethereal, like the whisper of a song carried on the wind. I smiled, a gentle, bittersweet smile. Perhaps it was the memory of the choir, their voices still reverberating in the very bones of the town, a reminder that the past never truly leaves us. It lingers, not in torment, but as part of the fabric of who we are, woven into the present like a thread of forgotten gold. I turned and began to walk back toward home, my footsteps light, my heart steady. The cathedral was no longer a place of horror. It was a place of healing, of remembrance. And as I walked away, the faintest whisper of a song lingered in the air, fading into the dusk, silent yet full of meaning.